Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, where craft meets scholarship. And this is the launch of the Critical Craft Studies series. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià, Montréal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, examining research questions, projects happening across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream both to YouTube and to Zoom. And so for those of you joining us on Zoom, your comments and questions are very welcome. Just pop those into the chat. When we have a Q&A moment a little bit later, we will do our best to read those out. Those of you here in the space, if you have questions, comments later on, just raise your hand. We'll run around with a microphone to you so that everyone can hear. Okay, but that's much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to PhD Professor of Craft Studies in the Department of Art History, Elaine Patterson. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. So some of my intro remarks have already been said, but they bear repeating, I think. And I'd like to first say good morning to everybody, or whatever time of day it is from wherever you're joining us, and bon matin à tous. As Doug said, I'm Elaine Patterson, and I think I know most of you in the room, but maybe not everybody joining us remotely. I'm a professor of craft studies in the Department of Art History, and I'd like to introduce my collaborator, Susan Surette, who is an accomplished ceramist and colleague in the Art History Department here in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. C'est avec plaisir que nous vous recevons chaleureusement à l'Université Concordia et à Montréal pour le lancement de notre série et de son premier livre lors de l'événement aujourd'hui intitulé Where Craft Meets Scholarship. Welcome. Before we continue, we would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyankeaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. It is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples today. In an event centered on craft, we're mindful that so many craft practices draw their materials from the land: clay, fiber, metal, other natural materials. These practices remind us that stewardship of the land is not abstract, but lived, embodied, and often rooted in long-standing knowledge systems. We honor the past, present, and future connections between peoples, practices, materials, and this territory, and commit to nurturing respectful relationships within Montreal and Concordia communities. So to that end, Susan and I would like to welcome you all to Fourth Space, located in Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, to celebrate with us the launch of the Critical Craft Studies series of Bloomsbury Academic Press, and to the launch of the first book in this series, Irish Lacemaking, Art, Industry, and Cultural Practice by Dr. Molly-Claire Gillet. As most of you know by now, Susan and I are the co-editors of this series. We've collaborated on several edited volumes, Sloppy Craft and Craft and Heritage, both published by Bloomsbury Academic Press, and on a special edition on craft published by the Journal of Canadian Art History. So this series feels like a good fit with our ongoing practice of collaboration. And speaking of collaboration, this event could not have come together without the help of our team of 4 very capable and committed graduate students here at Concordia. Pramila Choudhary is responsible for putting together the craft kits that you may take with you or work on while we're here together. So they're in the back at the door by the right, and also on some of the tables. So please help yourselves and enjoy. These are made from materials from Concordia's Center for Creative Reuse, or SUCCR. Maurice Fox, Anouk Chartrand-Fayad, and Anna Klein have developed stimulating questions for their podcast with Molly-Claire Gillet, author of Irish Lacemaking, and also Daniel Fountain, author of Queer Crafts, Material Practices, and the Making of Identity, which will follow the launch and deepen the discussion of these 2 fantastic books in the series. So briefly then, the order of the day is an introduction of the book series itself, and then that will be followed by an introduction of Molly-Claire's book, where she'll speak with us about her process and take your questions then. We're also very pleased that Susie Nash, our commissioning editor at Bloomsbury Academic Press, has agreed to give a presentation on the publishing process. So we hope this will be a step in demystifying perhaps what comes next after a thesis or a dissertation. She'll also be available after the presentation for questions from many of you. Following this presentation, we invite those of you who are in the space with us to take coffee and tea and snacks with us. And this is courtesy of the Hive Co-op Cafe. That's a student-run cafe here at Concordia. So we hope you'll come and chat with us at that point too. And then finally, the podcast will be recorded in this space and in the room at 1:15. And so you're welcome to remain present and listen to these, to enjoy light refreshments as you do, or work on the material kits if you'd like, while you listen, and we hope that you do. You can also listen to this online. It'll be available to you to stream. Thanks to Fourth Space. So the programming we've created today is designed to be relaxed and engaging in its atmosphere, but voices do carry. So if you can keep that in mind as the recordings are happening and you move around the space, which we encourage you to do, especially during the meet and greet for coffee and chat following the Bloomsbury presentation. So most of all, thank you for joining us. Whether you're in person or remote, you are all most welcome. And with that, I'll hand it over to Susan to introduce the Critical Craft Studies series to you.
Thank you, Elaine. Is this on? Okay, good. Hi, I'm Susan Surette, and I teach craft and ceramics and textile histories here at Concordia. And I have been a ceramicist myself for many years. When Elaine and I were first approached by Bloomsbury a few years ago to co-edit a series built upon critical craft scholarship, we were challenged to carefully consider the shifting parameters of this vibrant field that over the last very few decades has really evolved exponentially. Rather than try to pigeonhole it within rigid boundaries and act as gatekeepers, we chose to celebrate its multiplicity and multivocality. With the support of Bloomsbury, we decided to develop a series that publishes original research on the role and significance of craft in society and in culture, past and present. The series celebrates and informs about craft studies as a discipline in its own right, one that embraces the entanglement with indigenization, settler productions, interface with industry, relationships with design, ethics of production and distribution, do-it-yourself revival, maker culture, neurodiversity, well-being, and identity constructions, a long list. This series understands craft broadly as materials, genre, practices, and uses. Indeed, the contributions to this series will shape the series, and by doing so, make apparent what a craft lens can bring to academic scholarly concerns. In short, this craft lens, as we are using it, is not definable in an exhaustive way, but is always becoming a way of focusing, whether in approach, material, or practices. Bloomsbury Publishing, already home to a robust set of craft scholarship titles, albeit sprinkled among other academic series and fields, along with the well-established Journal of Modern Craft, is a welcoming abode for critical craft studies. As an interdisciplinary series, Critical Craft Studies is designed to foster discussion and form a springboard for further research and discourse by researchers and scholars around the world. Our hope is to make visible and amplify, not simplify, amplify those academic discussions and voices that put craft in the spotlight. We welcome proposals for books that offer an interdisciplinary and global approach to craft, including contributions from many fields, such as anthropology, material culture, cultural geography, heritage studies, critical race theory, architecture and design, art history, sociology, and studies in gender and sexuality, critical disability, migration, and sustainability, among others. In drawing this work into a series, broad themes, approaches, and many aspects of a craft lens which could include attention to materiality, process, ethics of production, among others, will emerge and be visible. This is the overall goal of the series, craft in its own right. Our call for proposals list of themes speaks to the concerns of the current academic environment and reflects the richness of research that is happening within the field of craft studies at the moment. We expect to regularly update the list of themes over time to maintain the relevance of the series to the field it represents, while also shaping the field through this series. From the start, the aim is that the coverage of the series will be wide-ranging to showcase the broad remit of research being undertaken and particular underrepresented aspects within the field. Again, it is not meant to be exhaustive, but continually emerging, changing the field itself. Thank you. Elaine.
Thanks, Susan. I don't know if is my mic on? I can't hear myself, so that's probably a good thing. Yeah, I guess to wrap up, we've been asked, and it seems a fitting way to end the series opener, the question, is this a highly interdisciplinary series that aims to draw its pool of contributors from many different disciplines, or is there an inherent interdisciplinarity to the craft field itself, perhaps in method or approach, that the series is trying to tease out? And the short answer to that is it is both those things. Craft has many disciplinary homes, and this series will reflect that history while offering an umbrella, we hope, under which to consider this scholarship as a cohesive, critical framework. The series will contribute to all of the other disciplines as well. They're not mutually exclusive. Entanglements with feminisms, gender studies, queer studies, among others, are welcome. And in a series like this one, the work coheres to become visible and recognized as a critical field in its own right. Critical craft studies have existed, as Susan said, for some time now, but in many disparate disciplinary contexts. And so as the field emerges, so will aspects of it. And we hope that will happen in part through this series designed to make space in scholarly publication for this work. And before we get on to the best part of this morning's conversation, which is the first book, I just wanted to draw your attention to, at the back of the room, there's the call for proposals with the list of titles upcoming, and also some codes for the first two books where you can get a discount code. So please make sure you go and take a look at those before you leave, for those of you in the space, and we will send that around to everybody registered for today as well. So with that, on to the best part, Irish lacemaking.
We are pleased to welcome Dr. Molly-Claire Gillet, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow co-located at the University of Galway, Ireland, and Trent University, Canada. She works at the intersection of making, place, and pedagogy, researching craft in Irish and Canadian rural women's organizations. Dr. Gillet was a scholar in residence in interdisciplinary studies and practices in the fine arts at Concordia University and completed her interdisciplinary PhD in 2022 with a dissertation that traced Irish lacemaking communities from the late 19th century to the present. Her dissertation became the book Irish Lacemaking, Art and Industry in Cultural Practice. Do you have a copy that I can just hold up?
Oh yeah, I can hold it up. Come and take a look later.
Thanks. This is the inaugural volume in the Critical Craft series. Today, we celebrate the launch of Irish lacemaking that grew out of years of remarkable research and creative practice. Dr. Gillet has brought together an extraordinary body of work, measured not only in miles traveled, but in the countless stitches, images, and conversations that have shaped this understanding of Irish lace history from the 19th century onwards. One of the most original and creative aspects of this book is the way she positions Emily Anderson, Moira Trainer, and herself as research author within the narrative. These women become touchstones in a story that moves gracefully between lived experience and broader institutional, colonial, and transnational histories that frame this craft. The depth of knowledge she has cultivated through both making and research is evident on every page. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Irish lacemaking and to celebrate the thoughtful, rigorous, and beautifully crafted work that Molly-Claire brings to us today. We are so pleased to have you join us in this conversation at Force-Based Concordia to launch your book as we launch our Critical Craft Studies series. Welcome, Molly-Claire.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you the first question. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Good. Your book emerges from your doctoral research, which you completed in the midst of a pandemic, a period that reshaped how you could work, travel, and connect with communities, and how your project unfolded. Looking back, how did that period redirect or deepen the research? And how did these shifts continue to ripple into the book project and into your postdoctoral work?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I think about the impact of the pandemic on my research, I actually don't remember the moment when I realized that my PhD research as planned was not going to work anymore and it would just have to be totally replanned. And I kind of wonder if I've cast that out of my memory because it was just a really traumatic moment, because I had I started the PhD in 2017, and as of summer 2018, I had already started trying to cultivate connections and relationships in the Irish lacemaking community because my goal was to travel around Ireland, going to the different lacemaking groups and learning. When I say learning, I don't mean learning to become an expert. I mean engaging in the practice of being a student of the various Irish lacemaking techniques with these different groups as a way to build relationships, as a way to understand a little bit more about how the laces are made so that I could better engage with the historic designs and understand why the designs were the way that they were. And I was starting to put that groundwork in place. I had been to the Traditional Lacemakers of Ireland, which is the big lacemaking group in the south of Ireland based around Cork City. I was about to reach out to the Guild of Irish Lacemakers, which is the big lacemaking group in Dublin and area. And I had been to the Clonus Lace International Summer School, which comes up quite a lot in the book. So I had this network that was kind of south, center east, and slightly north. I didn't have Galway area or the west covered yet. That would come later. That came much more recently, when I actually had a chance to meet lacemakers there. But all of that, of course, became immediately impossible as soon as the lockdowns started. And so the plan for not only how I was going to do research, but how I was going to engage with the communities that I was researching was totally kiboshed. And so again, I don't remember how I felt in that moment, and I don't remember how I came up with this plan. But what ended up happening was that my temporal focus kind of got stretched in a way. So I ended up focusing a lot more on the 19th century, which had never been my intention really, because of the fact that so much material was available online. And so doing archival research primarily through like the British parliamentary papers had never really been my plan. But I think that added an element to the more historical side of the research that ended up being really interesting and ended up being the place to go. I ended up being able to really develop the kind of themes of empire and colonial relationships through craft by focusing on that 19th century context. And then, so that was the stretch backwards, and then the stretch forwards was focusing on the one lacemaker with whom I had been able to make a connection and with whom I was able to connect online. So Moira Trenner has been using the internet to teach and to connect with lacemakers all over the world since long before the pandemic. She was connected with a lacemaking school in California. There's some amazing lacemaking museums and schools in California. For some reason, I don't know why, but that's the place to be. And so she was already connected there. She was very active on Facebook, using WhatsApp to connect with lacemakers, and also already inviting lacemakers from other countries to come and teach at her school. So the fact that she was willing to engage with me. And I mean, thank you, Moira, for that, because I'm sure she had a lot of Zoom meetings to be in and a lot of WhatsApp calls with family and stuff, but she was willing to sit down on Zoom with me and talk about her practice and engage with me from a distance. And so that was kind of the stretch forward into the future. So these archival materials that I could access online, and then the lacemaker with whom I had actually been able to make a connection and with whom I was able to connect online. And so I try to be quite clear about that in the introduction to the book, that there are all of these other groups that are so active and so brimming with knowledge and expertise. It was largely because of the pandemic that it ended up being clonus crochet lacemaking that I focused on in this narrative, because of my connection with Moira and the sort of digital element.
Were you going to open up the techniques before you ended up with just clonus?
Like develop all
the different techniques, yeah.
Yeah, I think I have to be very careful. I never expected to develop expertise in all of these techniques,
No.
but I was hoping to really explore all of them materially. And so take time to, sit at the mixed laces table at the traditional lacemakers of Ireland many weeks in a row and work for many weeks on Carrick-Macross lacemaking, or, go to the Guild of Irish Lacemakers and meet the people that were working there and, take a Limerick lace class or something like that. I mean, I also went to the Ken Mare Lace and Design Center before the lockdowns and had a class with Nora Finnegan in needle lace making, which is so difficult and so fine and requires so much expertise, but more patience than anything. And so I was able to work with her for about 4 or 5 hours and then was never able to go back. So I have this kind of partially finished sampler, and you can see my stitches getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, and then I just stop. And it's like, you can see materially and visually what happens when you try something really hard without a teacher. Because as soon as I left her, I was absolutely helpless. I did not know what to do. So yeah, the intention had been to engage with all of the different lace making techniques. And to this day, I mostly have in different ways, but not to the depth that I had been hoping to as part of that research.
Thank you, Molly-Claire. That's very interesting. Elaine.
I think you're underselling your abilities, your skills, but we'll leave that for a conversation on another day. I guess one of for me, the striking features of the book, and it's something that I'm a little bit familiar with, and you've talked a little bit about that kind of pulling backwards, but the historical archive sits alongside your own lived encounters, such as they are. So the field work that you were able to do and have subsequently done, relationships formed, whether online or in person, and even the anecdote about playing charades in your introduction was lovely and really brings the reader into the world of lace making and your world in a very immediate and really engaging ways, I think. So congrats on that. So my question then is really, what was the impetus, and you've alluded to it a little bit, but the impetus to balancing archival research with embodied contemporary experience, and has that balance changed now that you're working post-PhD?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the speculative historical fiction sections, and I think I really have to give a shout out to Susan Cahill, who was on my committee at the very beginning and then subsequently left to become a novelist, and who was in the School of Irish Studies and an expert on children's literature and girlhood in literature. And one of the things that she encouraged me to do was to experiment with writing and experiment with thinking about these characters that I was researching, and so that was an experiment. That element of trying to kind of imagine Emily Anderson and write about Emily Anderson. But one of the things that emerged out of that is that I found that a lot of the experiences that I was having as a researcher who was traveling to these spaces felt like they were probably similar to some of the things that she might have experienced. And I had to be very careful in framing that in the book and in my thesis as well. And I still, it's something to think about. I think you have to be careful about kind of creating comparisons between people in different historical eras and all this sort of thing. And it's sort of presented in a playful and speculative and imaginative way. But I think that a lot of the experiences that I had of traveling around the country and observing people at work and trying to understand what they were doing, those experiences struck me as similar to the experiences that she was having as a lace inspector, traveling around the country and observing people at work, and being tired and like traveling alone and staying in a different place every day. And the story about charades, which I imagined her doing as well, comes from just having a really lovely place to stay, having a colleague in Ireland who offered me a place to stay while I was briefly in the Galway area. And it was just such a lovely, refreshing welcome after staying in kind of cold Airbnbs where I had to make small talk with somebody I didn't know and I just wanted to go to sleep, and being in this lovely, warm family home and playing charades with the kids after dinner and just being hosted so nicely. And I think that there are these elements of doing research that I wanted to sort of bring into the book and kind of position myself as a researcher in the book. And so I think one of the ways that I did that was through writing about Emily Anderson and kind of positioning her as a character, but at the same time positioning me as a character and kind of establishing these through lines or similarities between our experiences as a way of thinking about positionality. I think of, for example, a lot of feminist geographers, feminist geography in general thinks a lot about positionality and researcher positionality and power relationships in research. And so somebody like Gillian Rose, for example, would say, you need to always be thinking about your positionality in research and thinking about the problematics of that and incorporating those tensions into the work that you do and incorporate a consideration of those tensions into the work that you do. So I think I tried to lean into the notion of positionality and almost play with it a little bit, and really think about who I am in these networks of people, but also who am I in relation to these documents and these practices, and maybe push that in some ways that were a little bit more creative or a little bit more playful. Does that answer the question?
I love how you brought that creative side to the concept of positionality that is very front and center at the minute, especially, but yeah, you do it in a really unique way in this. And I also think that those Emily Anderson vignettes are almost their own story within a story or narrative within a narrative. And I know that that was something you had played with as well, I think you said. So.
And I wanted somebody to be able to pick up the book and engage with a sort of meta-narrative if they didn't want to read all of the pages that, you know, the literature review elements or the very like close reading of designs from 1883. I wanted somebody to be able to pick it up and look at the beautiful images and get some inspiration perhaps for their own practice, and then read an interesting narrative alongside those images. And so I like the idea of there being several narratives at once in the text, and elements of the text being more interesting or more accessible to different audiences.
Thank you. I have another. I see you've brought many objects here today, which is wonderful, lace and images. So I was wondering if you could tell us about them, why you chose these pieces perhaps, and how they might illuminate some aspects of your book.
Okay. Thank you for asking me to bring some things, because it was really fun to pick them. Maybe I'll start with the postcards on the, I guess you can see them up on the screen here. So at the very beginning of my research for this project, I was meeting with Alex Ward, who's a curator of textiles and costume at the National Museum of Ireland. And she mentioned that I was interested in this designer, Emily Anderson. A lot of the designs in the collection seemed to be by her, and I had noticed her name before. And she mentioned that, not Emily Anderson, Alex Ward, mentioned that a family member of Emily Anderson had contacted her at some point in the past, asking if she could bring a collection of objects to the museum. And the museum, as you might imagine, gets lots of requests like this. All museums do. You know, I have something from my family that's really important. Can I give it to you? And they often can't, almost never can actually take these things because they get so many requests. But she managed to find the contact information for this person. And it turns out that Emily Anderson's great niece was living on Vancouver Island in Canada. And so she put us in touch, and I was able to talk to Patricia Anderson about her family, and I was able to go to her house and see the things that she had kept. Her family had been great archivists, but at one point somebody had gotten rid of a whole bunch of things. So she only had a little bit left. But what she had was a sketchbook from her great aunt Millie, everybody called her. And this sketchbook had been from her great aunt's studies somewhere. They were a lot of watercolor studies, sketches, that sort of thing. And I was able to later identify that these sketchbooks had been from when Emily Anderson had gone to the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, in London to study. So she had been sent from Ireland to London to study through the Department of Science and Art as part of her education. So I was able to therefore make a case that actually these objects should be in the National Museum. And then I was entrusted by Pat with the task of bringing them over to Dublin and kind of lodging them at the museum with Alex, which was a little bit nerve-wracking because I have a bad history of leaving things on planes, and I was really afraid I was going to lose them. I left my fiddle on a plane recently, and they told me they couldn't find it at first, which was terrifying. So I was a little worried that would happen. But anyways, I was able to take this stuff to the museum. And one of the collections of objects that the museum wasn't able to take because they couldn't establish its historical relevance was a package of postcards and photographs, one letter, I think 2 letters. And so I still have these postcards, some of which are annotated in Emily Anderson's writing, many of which are linked to locations that I think that she probably went, but I'm not sure, including Montreal. If you come up later, there are some fabulous postcards of like people cross-country skiing on Montréal, and like a girl with a child in a toboggan wearing a really cool like conical hat. But anyways, these postcards to me kind of speak to that tension in imagining these historical characters. You know, we have these kind of glimpses of where they might have been, but we're not really sure. Like I kind of can laugh at myself a little bit because I want to believe that Emily Anderson was in Montreal. I don't actually know. She sailed on a ship called the Montreal to visit her family. That doesn't mean she was in Montreal. I mean, it might have come through the city. I guess I could research that. Is it important for me to research that? I don't know. But they're kind of these evocative snapshots of a life that I have become interested in, that is interesting to me because of the very precise focus of my research. Is it interesting to anybody else? Not really. Even the family didn't really need these or want these. So it kind of speaks to me of that positionality element and storytelling element, and the fact that I think oftentimes I feel like I'm not allowed to be so interested in the characters that come up in my research. And I think I challenged myself in this project to kind of lean into that a little bit and play with that idea of being interested in these people's lives and wanting to imagine these people's lives. And you know, charting a space for that and making it clear where the distinction between that and the historical material, where one ends and the other begins, but still kind of allowing myself to enter that space. So those postcards I brought for that reason. The Limerick Lace Sampler, which is in the middle, the partially finished butterfly, which I think you can kind of see on the screen, that is a sampler that I started with the Corab Lacemakers, a lacemaking group based near Galway City. And I was learning, I had a workshop with one of the lace teachers there, Anya Hanrahan, and I think that butterfly is a good example of that sort of half-finished project and the importance of mentorship in teaching, because I started working on it with her just a couple months ago when I was back there, or maybe a year ago now. And as soon as I left the workshop, I told her, oh yes, I'll finish it when I go home, like it'll be great. And she said, are you sure about that? I think you might want to wait till you come back so I can help you. And then indeed about 2 weeks later, I sent her a message and said, like, this is where it is. I need your help. I have to wait till I come back. So I know for some people, learning from videos or learning from books is really effective, but for me, I have to be in the space with a person teaching me how to do the thing. That has been my experience with lace making, and I think that kind of experience of having to be in the space with the person doing the thing has really inflected the way that I've engaged with the material practice of lace making, because it's made it just as much about learning as it has, and the sort of social and material elements of learning, than as, just picking up the practice and doing it on your own. The little boat, which I think is upside down right now, but the upside down boat in the top left-hand corner is a small piece of Carrick-Macross lace that was given to me by the members of the Barna Irish Countrywomen's Association Guild just this spring, I believe, or maybe last fall. Because my current work involves going around to Irish Countrywomen's Association guilds and Women's Institute branches, 2 rural women's groups, one in Ireland and one in Canada, to learn about their craft histories and their present day practices. And this sampler was given to me sort of as a thank you for coming to a branch. It was made by Noni Hickey, who's a really, really talented Carrick-Macross lace maker. She's done commissions for people. She has made objects for family members. And I'm really grateful to her because she has kind of taken me on as a fellow lace enthusiast, and she's introduced me to a lot of people, been very kind to me, and been a champion of my work with the ICA, and sort of invited me to things, been quite welcoming, and I'm really thankful for that. But it's also a reminder of the ways in which access to a lot of these spaces and practices is dependent on relationships, and none of the work that went into this book, except for maybe the digital archive style work, would have been possible without people being welcoming and people being hospitable and people inviting me into their practice, or even inviting me into their home or the space of their club or their guild. And so there are way, way, way too many people to reference by name. But somebody like Noni, or somebody like Mary Starr, who made a 12-foot long Carrick-Macross wedding veil, and was kind of a local celebrity in the traditional lace makers of Ireland for making such a big project, welcomed me into her home to show me the veil and to talk to me about the process of making it, to show me the designs. She didn't have to do that, and so these kinds of projects are really dependent on people going out of their way to be generous and to be hospitable. So I really want to underscore that and thank those people. The last thing is the Rose Garden bonnet, which is one of the bonnets that was made as part of my doctoral work, and then is subsequently mentioned in the book. It was made for one of my goddaughters who was born in 2020, and the pattern was kind of a play on a pattern of Moira Trenner's, and it's based on one of the most traditional motifs, or it uses a lot of one of the most traditional motifs in Clonus crochet lace, which is the wild rose, which has many petals. And it took me a really long time to figure out how to make that rose with the petals swirling up in the right way rather than, or swirling down. I think I made them swirling up. But all of the roses are in there, the ones that were made correctly, that were made incorrectly, they're all kind of shoved in. But that bonnet and the other 2 that were made as part of that project and then subsequently reflected on in the book are all part of that sort of embodied element that you mentioned earlier of trying to engage in some of the practices that contemporary lace makers engage in. So making things for other people, gifting them, and reflecting on how the practice of making is inflected by all of these other practices that kind of hold it. So the idea of expressing relationships through giving things, sourcing materials, what is the experience of making in one's home like. And I think one of the reasons that it was important to engage in these practices myself and reflect on them is because increasingly I felt like it was not the right thing to do to try and analyze the motives and inner lives of the contemporary lace makers that I was working with. So there are elements of that in the text, but I wanted to turn the lens, so to speak, on myself and analyze my own motives and my own experiences, because that felt like a more respectful thing to do in the moment. And so that was kind of another reason, I suppose, for that focus on embodied practice.
It's making me think of the hospitality that you're talking about is, I think, also a reflection of the way in which you conduct yourself in research and build those relationships over time, and the way that you're talking about connecting with the people. And it kind of leads into what I was going to ask you in this next question, if we have time. If you don't mind, because the whole process of transforming, of course, a PhD dissertation into a monograph requires possibly complete reimagining, but certainly reshaping and making choices about that. And so some of the relationships and that deepening of that access through those forms of hospitality have happened subsequently. So I guess I'm wondering if you'd speak a little bit about what, how you made those decisions, what to keep in, what to reimagine, how to reshape, and also maybe speak a little bit more about some of the relationships or communities that may have steered where the book ended up vis-a-vis the original research practice of the PhD.
Yeah, I mean, I have to also give kudos to my supervisors, one of whom may or may not be here in the space, who encouraged me, or maybe almost gave me permission to write the thesis in a way that felt like it could be engaging to the communities that I was working with. So from the very beginning, I tried to write my thesis in such a way that it would be of interest, that it would have these different sort of strands of text or strands of narrative that could be read according to one's level of interest or according to one's desired focus. I wrote it in engaging language, or at least I tried to. Of course, there are things you have to do in a thesis. You have to do a really big literature review, and I did do that. But I think from the very beginning, I was given permission to write something that was maybe actually a little bit more like a book than a typical doctoral thesis, because it became part of the research methodology and the research ethic to write in an engaging and accessible way, because I wanted to write a document that may be of use to the communities that I was working with, or that may be of interest to the communities that I was working with. And I do think that perhaps in a different context, I might not have been allowed to do that. I might have been encouraged to kind of, cover the work in that sort of crust of academic language, which is, there's, of course, it's very, very important to do rigorous work and to have things like a literature review and to have all of these kind of these scaffolds that support research. And I hope that those are also all present in the work. But I think from the very beginning, I was encouraged to write in a more, or given permission to write in a more accessible way. And so that meant that the transition from thesis to book felt a little bit more intuitive, or a little bit more seamless. I didn't feel like I had to totally redesign and reimagine the entire project. I did cut out a lot of historical background and a lot of the literature review and those sorts of things that people tend to cut out of theses when they're transitioning to a book. I rewrote a lot of the speculative historical fiction sections quite significantly. They were kind of made more grounded in archival material, which I think was a really good choice, and that came based on a reviewer comment who was encouraging me to kind of think about what these sections were for. And at first I thought, oh no, my precious historical fiction, like this was the part that I was really nervous about and now it's being critiqued. But I think that was really helpful and really generative, and it encouraged me to just, think about what they were for and think a little bit more carefully about the prose as well. So those are the main things, just rewriting those and cutting out some of the material towards the beginning. But also I was able to do a little bit more research. There, again, because of the pandemic, there had been some places that I hadn't been able to go. And so I was able to go to the National Art Library at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I was able to go to the National Archives at Kew and actually affirm some gaps that I thought were probably there, but I couldn't totally confirm that they were gaps. And as I was able to go and affirm that, yes, indeed, there is nothing about this here. So there we go. And in a couple cases, find a couple little extra tidbits to throw in. But I think there was a danger of, again, having access to all of this stuff and then just continuing on and turning it into a whole new project, because all of a sudden I could be back traveling around Ireland again and going to all the archives. And I actually think that not allowing myself to do that, saying, you have enough, just think about the formatting, helped me to make the project happen instead of having it drag on indefinitely. Yeah. Sorry, was there another part to that question?
No, I think it's, I don't know if Susan, I'm mindful of our time. I want to let the audience also pick your brain.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, and I think I was going to ask you about future directions, but I think it might be better if we open up to the audience to ask questions. All right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's anything online or if anyone in the room has any questions or comments they'd like to ask Molly-Claire.
Hello. Just letting anyone know online, if they do have a question or comment, just pop that into this chat. Here in the space, I see a hand up, so.
Hello, I just want to say congratulations. It's so beautiful to hear about your work, Molly-Claire, and to see this project materialize. I have a very obvious question that maybe a lot of people here know, or maybe you brought up earlier, but I missed. But just very basically, why Irish lace making in particular? Was there something in particular about Irish lace making? Were there other kinds of lace making that you had looked at? I guess that was like one of my central questions, is like, it seems so specific and so like such a specific field. And I was wondering how you got into that specifically, and were there other like geographies of lace making too that interested you throughout that project? And then why did you end up landing on Ireland specifically?
Yeah, it's funny. That question just doesn't occur to me anymore, but it's a really good question. Well, another person to thank is Janice Helland. She was one of my professors when I was doing my master's at Queen's University in Kingston. And I did my master's thesis research on religious sculpture of the Chiloé archipelago in the south of Chile, which is like, I mean, it's similar to Ireland. They're both cold and rainy, and there's a lot of sheep, but it's a very different context. And I took a class with her, and it was about things in Victorian paintings. And so we had to find a Victorian painting, find a thing in it, and then write about the thing. And I wrote about a painting called The Secret of England's Greatness. As you can imagine, themes of empire, all of this kind of stuff. But Queen Victoria in this painting is wearing a lace dress, and the lace takes up almost like the whole picture plane. It's this huge white lace dress. And I was really interested in the lace. And Janice was very happy that I was interested in the lace, because she was very interested in Irish lace and has written great work about British and Irish crafts and home industries, and also written about Irish lace. And so I started looking into kind of the history of Irish lace making, and very quickly realized that one of the central contexts for lace making in Ireland is this colonial context, so the idea of lace being made by very poor women in primarily rural areas, but also in towns, and consumed primarily by people in Britain in really elite contexts, but also that the lace industry, not entirely, but largely emerges from the time of the famine in the mid-19th century and is implemented as a relief measure. It's a philanthropic measure, again, by primarily elite people with connections in Britain or elite people from Britain. And so that colonial context was really, really interesting to me, and the idea of textiles being so clearly related to issues of politics and of power and of these international networks. And so I had been interested in Ireland for a while. I had done an undergrad exchange in Ireland, but it was really that context and the really clear, like blindingly obvious link between textiles and issues of like politics and power and international relations. And now that I know a little bit more about people that are working on textiles, I realize this is not unusual. Like this is a thing that we see all over the world, which is one of the reasons that craft is such a rich theme. One of the reasons that this series exists. But I had never come across that before. That was kind of a moment of discovery. And so it's really because of that dress. And then I found newspaper accounts from newspapers in Ireland. When that painting was taken on tour in Ireland, people in like the rural west of Ireland were, and I still remember this word for word, sniffing the canvas like bloodhounds, which don't describe people that way. But also, it seemed to me to indicate like a deep interest in the detail in the painting. And I was thinking, what if one of those people's sister made that train? That is entirely possible. And so thinking about that idea of like relationship to these elite textiles in these very so-called marginal spaces, and it was just that dress and the story of that dress opened a world in a way.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I found it so interesting what you were saying about having to learn the craft in person, and that it is such a kind of like socially embedded, I guess, practice. So I was curious if you were able to learn what you might have been able to learn about sort of the historic networks, I guess, in communities, like the guilds that you were mentioning, in terms of how they worked and shared information. And then I'm also curious if there are sort of any continuities, today, or how it would have changed with, what you were mentioning about, I think Moira, was it, who shares information like via WhatsApp and the internet, and these are sort of new global, I guess, networks or pathways for the craft to move and evolve in. So that's maybe a vague question, but if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have to be very clear that for me, being in person is really important, but I'm really cautious of that, of like what might follow from saying something like that, this assumption that we can only learn these skills in person, right? Because even so, in the last chapter of the book, one of the things I talk about is how Moira Trenner, as a maker of Clonus crochet lace, was really informed by this kind of ongoing genealogy of women in that community who passed these skills on to one another. And when she teaches, she really locates her teaching practice in that genealogy, but also in the space of like the place of Clonus and of County Monaghan. And I've seen that in, again, I wasn't able to do that kind of in-depth work with any of the other groups, really. And now, unusually, the lace-making group that I'm most connected to is in Galway, where there aren't really many historic lace-making. I mean, there's Limerick lace, there's Carrick, there's no Galway lace. But I mean, there is a lace-making tradition from that area, and lace has been made there for a long time, but many of those makers are kind of creating this new tradition of making lace in Galway, but using these lace-making techniques from different cities. So that's something as well. I suppose what I'm saying is that there's always a counter argument to the argument. So she is locating her practice in place and then teaching online to these women in California, in Sunnyvale, California, I think it is. That's where the museum is. But always locating the skills that she's teaching them in this genealogy and in place through, for example, having motifs that are named after certain people, or talking about Cassandra Hand, who was the philanthropist that started that industry, and telling them about the Cassandra Hand School and where Cassandra Hand lived. So the stories are really intertwined with the material skills. So even when they're being shared online, at least in this one person's practice, they're really being grounded in place and in a genealogy. That said, a lot of this stuff also circulates in a totally contextless way. I mean, as you know, right, that's what happens. And so there are people that are learning these skills in a way that is totally detached from that context. And a lot of the makers that I've spoken to feel quite ambivalent about that, because they're really glad that the skills are being passed on, and they're glad that people are developing expertise in something that's really important to them, but they also have a really keen awareness of the history. Most of the makers that I have spoken to, if I've had any kind of in-depth conversation, they'll draw my attention to the history of lace making in their area, to the idea of lace making out of necessity because of poverty. They'll often tie it to the famine. It's very important to them that I understand the history as well as the material, whatever history may mean to that person. There's that really close link. So there's this sense of ambivalence about locating the craft in a story and in a place, and wanting that to be valued, but then also recognizing that it's kind of cool that somebody is developing a really high level of expertise in clonus crochet in Thailand and then posting about it on Instagram, and they just found out, and they're going like, whoa, she's really good. Where did that come from? How did they get the book, you know? So there's kind of that sense of tension, and even in the work that I'm doing right now, which is with the Irish Countrywomen's Association, so a group of primarily older women, there's kind of this stereotype that you only learn by hand and that we're not engaging with technology, and they'll often talk about how they would much prefer to learn in person, but then they'll say, oh no, wait, I'm just gonna look up a video on YouTube. Okay, yeah, that's how you do it. Or I'll say, oh, where did you learn how to do this? And they'll say, oh, it's on Pinterest, I forget which page. You know, so there's this kind of fluid engagement with technology and with in-person interaction, and it's not a binary, it's somewhere in the middle, and it's based on personal preference and what you have access to, you know?
Just wanted to be mindful of the time. I know there are people joining us from other time zones, but there was some questions in the chat, and there is one that would maybe be a nice last question, Molly-Claire. Marlene is asking if we could return to Susan's earlier question about future directions. Maybe you could kind of speak to that.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess I already mentioned it a little bit, but the work that I'm doing right now is using maybe similar methodologies, but in a different context. So I'm doing a postdoctoral fellowship right now. I'm about halfway through, and I'm looking at craft practices in the Irish Countrywomen's Association, which is an organization that was founded in 1910, associated with the cooperative movement in Ireland, and is still active. And the Women's Institutes in Ontario, which were founded in 1897, again, still active. And I'm looking at assembling kind of craft histories of both groups, but also looking at their present day practices and looking at what craft means to them now and what they do with craft now and what craft does to them now. And I guess one of the things I can highlight is this, this case of technology and craft and the case of pedagogy and craft. So just as a kind of snippet of what I've been working on most recently is I've been looking at the Irish Countrywomen's Association as kind of an example of informal pedagogy and pedagogy that makes use of technology and in-person experiences and sort of a mix of institutional structures and organic local structures. So it's really, really fascinating to see this unfold. It's not something that I anticipated or imagined would be a focus of the research. I'm sorry, I'm looking right at you because it's kind of related to the question that you asked. But I guess, hello, Marlene, as well. Nice to see you virtually. So one of the things that's emerged in that project and that I'm pursuing and really interested in is how craft education works in these sort of formal, informal contexts. So the ICA has a body that evaluates people's craft skills and gives them qualifications to teach certain crafts and runs a craft education institution. So there's this kind of formal structure that supports craft education, which is kind of unusual. Like Ireland is quite an unusual context in terms of having this kind of craft education system that is not through a university or a technical college, it's through this organization specifically. But then you also see this really organic network of teachers develop where there's all these people who do not have the formal qualifications. And sometimes they'll say, like, you can't call me a teacher. I'm not officially a teacher because I don't have the certificate. But they'll be traveling around to different guilds, teaching skills that they've learned and developed high levels of expertise in on their own. And different guilds, which are the local units, a village or a neighborhood, will have people that go to, for example, a craft class in Dublin and then come back and teach it to everybody. And it's strikingly formal, the way that this works. Like, it is your job to come back and teach everybody if you've been to a craft class at one of these institutions. You also have skills coming from different countries, people going on holiday, bringing skills back from a place like Malta, for example, and teaching it to everybody in the guild. So I'm finding it to be a really interesting case study in how these communities that might be described in policy documents as very marginalized or might be imagined as marginalized, like older women in rural areas, through craft pedagogy, you're seeing a tremendous amount of mobility, engagement with technology, social networking, community building. You're seeing all of this activated through wanting to learn about craft and wanting to share craft skills. So that's kind of a direction that work is going, but very much out of the lace work. I made a lot of the connections in that world through the lace research.
I think this wraps up the question period, but Molly-Claire will be with us both in person for coffee and more chat, and also, luckily, a whole podcast to deepen this conversation. So I hope some of you will tune into that. And in the meantime, many thanks, Molly-Claire, for the generosity of your thinking and talking to us about your book and your future projects, which is so exciting to listen to you go and watch you develop this area for critical craft scholarship. I really appreciate that. And it's quite lovely to see how you can entangle care and scholarship and making together so beautifully in a book and in the way that you present all of your research. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Molly-Claire. It's great to have you back here. Thank you, Susan. And also for the questions, everyone online. Appreciate those. Just going to let you know, we're going to be closing up the live stream, but we're going to leave the Zoom open. That's all I have to say for that. Thanks for joining us. So those of you on Zoom, please stick around. We're going to be transitioning into a workshop on preparing a manuscript with Bloomsbury's commissioning editor, Susie Nass, in a couple minutes. So stick around. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Okay.
And we wanted to create a space for dialogue for craft scholarship. And please feel free to stay with us to hear what Susie Nash has to say. Are we transitioning now?
Hi, everyone.